Former U.S. First Lady Michelle Obama and former candidate for president Bernie Sanders will headline tonight's opening segment of the Democratic National Convention that will formally nominate Joe Biden for president later this week. But the in-person event in Milwaukee in Wisconsin, with thousands of festive delegates coronating their pick, has been shelved due to the coronavirus pandemic, with both Biden and his vice presidential pick Kamala Harris due to accept their nominations virtually, and this is for the first time in history. Sherwin Bryce-Pease chatted to a political historian about this year's history-making virtual event.
Professor Joshua Brown, thank you so much for speaking with us.
Happy to be here.
Election season in the United States enters a new phase Monday with the start of the Democratic National Convention, followed by the Republicans a week later, minus, of course, the thousands of cheering delegates, balloons, and festivities. What can you say about how different things are going to be this year and what sort of impact that's going to have as we move towards Election Day?
Well, it's, of course, an open question. Certainly in the 20th century, the nominating conventions are really not only a big business, so you have, of course, now the reverberations of all these local businesses, for example, in Milwaukee, not being able to take advantage of this. And then, of course, the spectacle. The whole thing here is really about the spectacle, being in arenas, large crowds, enthusiastic crowds, and multi-day. So you sort of have a build-up to the very moment where the nomination of the president takes place. There really hasn't been a contested nomination, I believe, since the 1950s, when Adlai Stevenson was running for president against Dwight Eisenhower. So it's not as if it's not predictable what's going to happen. But I think that'll be the really big difference. I'll be very curious to see after the first day how much of viewership it receives over television, which, of course, now at this point has I think it's 60-year record of being the way that most people participate. So I think it'll be a challenge to begin with. So I think the question is, and you have some sense that the Democrats have thought of this before, that there'll be some show business people, they're going to bring in some celebrities, there'll be a preoccupation with holding on to viewers, and that'll be, I think, an interesting innovation.
So beyond the formality of selecting the party's nominee for president and vice president, this is also about the party platform and adopting rules of the party's activities.
Right.
That and why that is so important.
Well, it's an interesting question because I'm not sure how important it is. We've certainly seen that candidates often wander away from the platform. The platform is obviously a negotiating period of time where a lot of the constituencies, and obviously in this case you've already seen that Bernie Sanders has met with Joe Biden about including some of his concerns, progressive concerns of progressive constituency, what can be included in. And we've already seen clearly some compromises that have taken place. I'm curious, as I've always been, how much the public pays attention to the platform. Certainly committed participants, those people who are really in the inside of the party, are going to be looking at that platform. But in many ways, there's a lot more to say about what the candidates are saying.
So tell us then what you think this election is going to be framed around. We're about 2.5 months out. What are the issues in this election?
Well, it should come as no surprise that a major issue is, of course, going to be the coronavirus and how terribly the Trump administration has handled or bungled the coronavirus. And then, of course, the ramifications of that, which, of course, included the economy. So I don't think there's any question that is going to be a major factor. It's interesting to see that already the Republicans are trying to shift the issue away from the virus itself. In fact, Trump in his so-called press conferences now barely talks about the coronavirus, but indeed goes off on various diversions.
What are the challenges facing the Republican Party in general and President Trump in particular. You mentioned the coronavirus being one. You know, we can always look back at that famous phrase that's about the economy stupid. A new poll today, NBC News, Wall Street Journal, has Biden up 9 points nationally. What did those numbers say about what needs to happen in terms, if you're Donald Trump and the Republican Party right now?
I think that there's no question that the economy will come up as a factor. I mean, we are really on the verge of at least in terms of the economy, a depression that threatens to have a huge impact not only on cities but on the countryside. We've certainly heard lately that farmers are really being hit by this. So I think that's going to be a factor that will affect the Republican Party. Now, there's the interesting difference now from 2016 is, of course, Trump is the incumbent. Now, historically, incumbents do fairly well on their second-term elections. And I think on some level they're counting on that. And the promise, as he has been making, that, well, it's going to be different. When the new year comes, it's going to be a whole different world. I'm puzzled by that as a tactic, and we've already begun to see a shift to some of these discussions about, obviously, ethnicity. I mean, we're back to birtherism again as an issue to see how well, that flies for him. And of course, the whole question of mail-in voting, which I think is going to become a serious issue and perhaps the Achilles heel for Trump in a way that I don't think he's conceived of it so far.
What have you made, Professor, about the concerns that the president has raised, right, around mail-in ballots? And we're, of course, expecting a surge in that format because of the coronavirus and the public health emergency. His unsubstantiated claims of increased fraud as a result. What does that say when a U.S. sitting president, talks or casts aspersions about, one of the fundamental pillars of American democracy, which is how you vote in this country?
Well, it's outrageous. We've had mail-in voting since at least the Civil War. So, and it worked quite well in, the midst of perhaps the greatest emergency in U.S. history. I think that one needs to already consider that the presentation that Trump has made about contrasting mail-in voting as opposed to absentee ballots, and his, of course, claims about fraud aren't proven in terms, of course, at all in terms of fraud. I think it's 0.001% is the corruption factor. It's not a factor at all. But there's an interesting contrast between absentee ballots and mail-in ballots that has not really been emphasized enough. Because, in fact, mail-in ballots are substantially more efficient than absentee ballots. Mail-in ballots are controlled by the states, and therefore when one sends in their mail-in ballot, it's not going, as is the case in absentee ballots, to some place in another part of the country, but in fact go to a locality very near where you live. So the attempt by the Republicans at this point to, and certainly the Trump administration, to undermine the Postal Service may be undermined by the fact that mail-in votes will be able to not have to travel that far.
And which is a big concern that they've raised, right, is this notion that you won't get the election results on the night of the election, as come to be the case in the past. The Trump administration, Professor, or certainly Trump himself, talk a lot about the silent majority that will turn up on election day. When they see themselves lagging in the polls, this is what they talk about. Does this silent majority actually exist?
Well, it of course dates back to the Nixon administration that originally, I think it was the Vice President Spiro Agnew, who he didn't come up with the phrase, but he read the phrase. And the view then was, yes, that the silent majority was not being represented by the media. we do have to worry a bit about the voters who are perhaps even embarrassed to say in polls that they're going to vote for Trump, and that there may be, I wouldn't say a groundswell, but more voters than perhaps the polls are picking up. On the other hand, there are many, many different majorities and constituencies, and this is not the same country that it even was 4 years ago. And obviously, demographically, it's been shifting, to a I hesitate to use the term because I think it's not really accurate, but a non-white majority, which we saw the first inklings of it in the Obama presidency, but I think it's even grown stronger. And I think Trump has created a situation where he has alienated even parts of his own constituency. So it's going to be a phrase that we're never going to get away from, because it's a phrase you can't prove. It's a concept that always seems to be looming, and therefore has the notions of an omen that that might be fulfilled.
Yeah, we can't prove it before Election Day, but perhaps after, right?
Right.
So what are the challenges then? Let's touch on the Democrats. What are the challenges? They are now in the lead, a healthy lead, 9 points, some say double digits, leading in all the important swing states. What are the challenges facing the Biden campaign, particularly in the aftermath of his nomination of Kamala Harris as his VP choice?
Well, I think one is, of course, keeping the Democratic Party together in the sense that that certainly that we saw 4 years ago it was unable to do. That there was a lot of bad blood over the nomination process, or rather, the primary process, and that is going to be one challenge. Another, of course, is, as we began discussing, that this is a race that is unlike any previous race that we've had. This is really, I would say, it's almost like it's a pre-radio race, in the sense of the challenge of no direct participation in crowds, in the sort of excitement that one has in going to various rallies and seeing the candidates in person. I think that is going to be tough, particularly in light of the fact that we see so much of Trump on the television, and Trump in a slightly more, let's say, presidential mien. Having said that, I think that there is a very strong sense of the person. And I think that may be, it's both a challenge on one level, but on the other level, that this is going to be about, in some sense, the two different personalities. The other, I think, is that there will be certainly a certain amount of checking of the records, but again, we have, I think it's the bitterness that made examining Hillary Clinton a vulnerability in the last campaign. I'm not convinced is going to be true of this one, in large part because of the coronavirus, in large part because of the collapse of the economy, the large part of the constant lying. That doesn't mean he won't have a constituency that comes out. Now, that, of course, comes down to the big question, finally, of getting out the vote. And that, I think, is going to be the toughest thing, because you're not going to have a situation where, poll watchers are going to, the poll workers are going to be going out and churning up the vote in a way, the face-to-face way, which we really have become accustomed to.
Is this Biden's election to lose?
I wouldn't say that. I'm just going pessimistic by the number of times I've awakened the next morning or late that night, having not slept, to find out that my expectations have been completely undermined. So there's so much emphasis on his gaffes that I wonder whether they're not seeing the understanding that a gaffe is not the same thing as a lie.
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess that's where we leave it. Professor Joshua Brown, thank you so much for speaking with us.
Thank you.